Peace and good and greetings once again from the Shrine of St. Anthony. And we send a word of greeting to all our companions of St. Anthony who are joining us through this recording of our talk this evening or today. We're continuing with this series of online talks about St. Francis and about different aspects of his life. And this evening, in this second talk from this series, the evocative title is Killing Francis of Assisi, Creating St. Francis. So why don't we get into our topic for tonight? So let us begin by praying in the words of Francis of Assisi, his prayer before the crucifix. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity, sense and knowledge, Lord, that I may carry out your holy and true command. Francis of Assisi, pray for us. Before we begin, I would like you to imagine an image of St. Francis inside that frame that you see on your screen. What does he look like? What is he wearing? Where is he? Is he alone, or is he with other persons or things? What does his face look like? Is he young or old? Simply put, who is St. Francis for you? So last month in this series of talks, in the first talk about the earliest images of St. Francis, we focused on the story of the stigmata, the mystical experience whereby Francis's body bore the marks of the crucified Christ. In that talk, we began to explore how the image of St. Francis was created by this earliest iconography. Tonight, we want to look at this process of creating the image of St. Francis as we tend to understand him today. Hence, tonight's talk is entitled Killing Francis of Assisi, Creating St. Francis. Now, at the beginning, let us be clear, St. Francis of Assisi was not murdered. The evocative title is meant to make an important point and to generate some interest and hopefully some thought on your part. Some of you might be familiar with the series of popular history books produced by Bill O'Reilly, his Killing series. In these very engaging books, he presents an exploration of the killing of historical figures like Jesus or Lincoln or John Kennedy, but also the metaphorical killing of perhaps the Japanese war effort in World War II and the colonial bonds between Great Britain and the United States during the Revolutionary War. It is this metaphorical killing that we are speaking about tonight. As we will see, important aspects of the life and values of Francis of Assisi were killed, suppressed, in the process of creating the images of St. Francis. Some of these aspects and values were outright killed. Others were distorted to fit the agendas of his later followers, the Franciscan friars. So let us begin to look at this theme in more detail. In this talk, we will consider the two dynamics of killing and creating. Now, we should begin by noting something that is not well known or appreciated, that in the later years of his life, Francis of Assisi had become a marginalized figure in the spiritual movement that he had founded and led. And in the years following his death, certain aspects of his form of life were suppressed or manipulated. As part of the effort to create St. Francis through iconographic and literary images. But it is always important to remember that the creation of these images was controlled by the agenda of the creator. But first, what is an image? Well, it can be presented as literature or in iconography, a picture. The 20th century philosopher and critic Walter Benjamin noted that iconographic images, like the images of St. Francis we are considering, have a presence, what Benjamin called aura. That is, an image that we look at and which looks back at us. Francis of Assisi left a considerable body of writings that have been preserved and made available in English, thanks to the massive Francis of Assisi early document series that was published about 20 years ago. This series also includes most of the extant writings about Francis of Assisi that were created in the 2 centuries after his life and death. Again, all available to us in English translations. But we also have a number of early iconographic images of St. Francis, presented to us in a form called a Vita icon. So what is a Vita icon? It is an image that presents a full-length icon of the saint, surrounded by miniature scenes from his life and afterlife. There are 8 extant Vita icons from the 13th century that were created between 1235 and around 1280. It is vital to note that with one exception, the Rome painting, all of the Vita icons were created by Franciscan friars for Franciscan churches, for viewing and veneration by the public, who were mostly illiterate and had no access to the written literary accounts of the life of the saint. Now, when I say that these images were created by the Franciscan friars, I do not mean that they were painted by a friar, but rather that the overall program for each image was designed and approved by the Franciscan friars. Hence, they, not the craftsperson who painted the image, controlled what was depicted. Before we press on, let's review once again these 8 earliest extant images of St. Francis. The Pescia image, created in 1235, and the only one still in an active worship site. The Assisi image, created about 1253 for the Basilica of St. Francis. Rome, very similar to Assisi and based on Assisi, created for the papal court about 1255. Pisa, also created about 1255. Note how similar in format it is to Pescia. One for the Bardi family chapel at the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, created about 1260 and the masterpiece of the genre. Orte, also created about 1260. Pistoia, created between 1265 to 1274. And Siena, created about 1280. In this talk, we will be focusing on these Vita icon images of St. Francis. Why? Because the many literary sources were produced primarily by the friars for the friars. On the other hand, The Vita icons were produced to present the image of Francis to the broader church and to the world. As Pope Gregory the Great said, images are truly the book of the illiterate. We might also note here that it has been estimated that perhaps only 2% of medieval images have survived into our time. If that is true, then there may have been hundreds of these Vita icons created in the 13th century. Perhaps every Franciscan church of that century had a Vita icon. As we will see, these images were created to speak to the situation of the church where they were presented. Hence, each one creates a different, sometimes very different, image of St. Francis. By creating a very particular image of St. Francis, each Vita icon, in a sense, kills aspects of the form of life of Francis of Assisi that were not included in each of these localized images. In order to better understand how Francis of Assisi is killed, as it were, let us take a brief dive into the history of the Franciscan friars and their own troubled relationship with Francis of Assisi. Let's begin in the later years of his earthly life. We know with certitude that Francis traveled to Egypt to preach penance to Sultan al-Kamil in 1219 during the Fifth Crusade. His mission was to seek the conversion of the Sultan in order to curtail further bloodshed and war. Francis returned from the Holy Land in 1220 with his health compromised. On his return, he discovers the Friars Minor in great crisis. Feeling he was not up to the task at hand, he resigns his role as the administrator, or as he would say, his ministry and service to the order. But he retains his role as the spiritual guide of the movement, broadly understood. That is, not just to the friars, but also to Clare of Assisi and her sisters, and to the lay penitents who had associated themselves with Francis. He seeks to realize this role as spiritual guide by his word and example. Through his writings to the friars, the sisters, the penitents, and to many others. And through his faithful living of the primitive form of life, inspired by the gospel, that he and his brothers discerned and embraced from the very beginning of the movement. Hence, within the order of Friars Minor, and indeed the primitive fraternity founded by Francis and his brothers, had now become a canonical order, recognized and used by the institutional church. Francis of Assisi becomes a marginalized figure. These last 6 years are marked by a number of significant moments. Composing the final version of the approved rule for the Friars Minor, Christmas at Greccio in 1223, which we will consider in these talks in December, and the imprinting of the stigmata in the autumn of 1224. Most of the time during this period, Francis is living in relative obscurity as the Friars Minor grow exponentially and their form of life changes significantly from the primitive vision discerned and lived by Francis and his companions. By 1226, with his health failing and his life drawing to a close, the city of Assisi sends armed soldiers to bring him back to Assisi. In the Middle Ages, pilgrimages were a major economic industry, and Assisi wanted to ensure that the relics of Francis would be safely established within the walls of their city, ready for the visit of countless pilgrims and their money. This trafficking in Francis of Assisi continues down to our own time. Assisi is literally and metaphorically built on the bones of Francis of Assisi. Francis dies in the evening of October 3rd, 1226, at his beloved Portiuncula, the tiny chapel which he had rebuilt in his earliest days and which was now surrounded by primitive huts made from sticks and mud, where the friars of that place sought shelter. The following day, the soldiers and people of Assisi transfer the relics of Francis to the safety of the Church of San Giorgio inside the walls of the city. 34 years later, that church will be converted to become the Basilica of St. Clare after her death in 1253. Francis of Assisi was canonized quickly, less than 2 years after his death, by Pope Gregory IX on July 16th, 1228. The next day, Gregory IX laid the foundation stone for what would become the Basilica of St. Francis. Less than 2 years later, on May 30th, 1230, the relics of Francis were transferred to the tomb prepared for him deep under the altar of the lower church in the basilica, securely entombed in the living rock of Mount Sabazio. However, by medieval standards, this burial was very unusual. In this image, we see the main altar in the Basilica of St. Clare, as it is seen today. The tomb of St. Francis originally looked just like this. The altar of his shrine far above, his tomb in the rock below, surrounded by a pergola, the cage-like structure you see here, with a very tiny opening in the step before the altar that protected a small opening that went down to the actual tomb. While there was a secret access way to the tomb of Francis, this was very secret and sealed up in later years. In 1818, the friars of Assisi received permission from the Pope to excavate the tomb, and the crypt chapel that we see today was then created, having been redecorated in the 20th century. In this photograph, you can see the original stone tomb. Look at the altar, and then the tabernacle, and then the cross atop the tabernacle. Above the cross, you see an iron grating and iron bars. That is the original tomb, encased in the living rock of Mount Sabazio. But why this incredibly secure secret burial location? Why this mystery? Ostensibly to provide security from other cities near Assisi, like Perugia, from stealing the relics of the saint for economic reasons, a most common practice in the Middle Ages. And, or perhaps, to create an impenetrable barrier, physical, visual, spiritual, between the Francis of history and his own form of life and values, and the image of St. Francis, created by the friars through art and preaching in the basilica above the tomb. To offer some evidence that this second burial, the second reason may have some validity, let us explore how, by the time of Francis's secure burial, certain aspects of his form of life had become very inconvenient to the friars of that time. To do that, we need to briefly consider the history of the Franciscan friars in the years following the death of Francis of Assisi. Not because that history is very edifying or even interesting to us today. Indeed, in many ways, the history of the Franciscan friars is an 8th century long, slow motion train wreck. but because we need to understand that it was the Franciscan friars who almost exclusively controlled the creation of the image of St. Francis, both literary and iconographically, for centuries to come. For our purposes, we can focus our attention on one key moment. Around the time of the mysterious secret transferal of the relics of Francis of Assisi, the Franciscan friars were gathered at Assisi for a chapter, a meeting to discuss their current situation and to legislate for the future. At this chapter, the friars were dealing with a very delicate crisis. Before Francis died, he left a written text that is called the Testament. In that text, Francis calls the friars to be faithful to the original primitive form of life, especially regarding poverty and particularly concerning buildings. For example, by 1230, the friars had already established formal permanent residences in urban areas, such as Paris and London. So the question came up, is the testament binding on the friars now? As the rule was and is a papal document, the friars sent a delegation of learned friars to get a decision from Gregory IX, who ruled that the testament was not binding on the friars and that the interpretation of the rule ultimately belonged to the papacy and not to the friars themselves, which is still true today. And hence, the testament was effectively canceled, as we would say today, effectively killing certain values of and the form of life of Francis of Assisi. To return to our interests, let us consider the ramifications of this moment of history on the creation of the image of what we will now call St. Francis. The image of Francis of Assisi crafted by the friars in the first 60 years after his death through the creation of the Vita icons. Now, Francis of Assisi almost never spoke of his own life in his writings, but he does in that inconvenient, canceled text, the Testament, which begins, "The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, thus to begin doing penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. And afterwards, I delayed a little and left the world." What we want to highlight here is that Francis's experience of living with and serving the lepers of Assisi was the key moment in his own conversion. We know this from his own words here in the Testament. Given that, one would expect that if one wanted to depict the life of Francis of Assisi, one would perhaps begin with this critical, liminal moment in his life. But it never appears explicitly in any of the 8 extant Vita icons of St. Francis, or even in any other medieval image of St. Francis, as far as I can tell. Let us look at some of the earliest Vita icons to see what was depicted to teach us about the life of Francis of Assisi. In the Pescia panel from 1235, we see only 2 images from the life of Francis of Assisi: the Stigmata and the Preaching to the Birds, followed by 4 stories of miracles that happened after his death, mostly at the tomb of the saint in Assisi. Here we see the healing of a girl with a twisted neck, which occurred on the day of Francis's burial. The healing of a crippled boy. The healing of the crippled man, Bartholomew of Narni. And the exorcism of those afflicted with demons. All 6 of these are presented as miracle stories. In this image, St. Francis did not live with and serve the living dead of his world, the lepers. He was a worker of miracles. What is the message here? If you seek miracles, come to Assisi. Now, to be fair, last month we took a deeper look at this image and noted a deeper meaning behind the image. But a cursory reading of this image shows St. Francis simply as a miracle worker. The next extant Vita icon is the one from the lower church at Assisi from around 1253, around the time that the church was consecrated. Remember that the lower church was the tomb of Francis of Assisi up to the 19th century. The question that immediately comes to mind is, why create a Vita icon image for the tomb of the saint? His presence is there in his relics. Why create an iconographic presence of the saint? Well, remember that strangely, the pilgrim to the Basilica of St. Francis had no close access to the relics. They were 3 meters or so deep below the altar. Hence, the Vita icon was commissioned to communicate, if you will, that presence of the saint to the pilgrim. So what is depicted on this panel? First, the same posthumous miracle stories that we saw in the Pescia panel. There are no scenes at all from the life of Francis of Assisi. In a certain sense, the Francis of history is not present at all. Just St. Francis, who art in heaven. Even in his own tomb and basilica, the Francis of Assisi of history is a marginalized figure. This was later corrected with the production of a brief series of frescoes in the lower church, and then at the end of the 13th century, the great fresco cycle in the upper church. This is indeed strange. By 1253, St. Francis had been canonized for 25 years. He was a well-established saint. Why continue to present St. Francis only as a miracle worker? So far, the message is clear. The Franciscan friars are the custodians of the miracle-working St. Francis, one who does miracles, but does not challenge us in how we live in this world. The next extant Vita icon is the one from the Franciscan Church in Pisa, created around 1255. This panel has an interesting history. We know that in the 17th century, that this image of St. Francis was processed through the streets of Pisa during an outbreak of the plague. This indicates how the people of Pisa understood their presence of St. Francis as an intercessor and a miracle worker. We see this reflected in the stories depicted in this panel. Here we see the same 4 miracle stories from Pescia and Assisi, with the addition of 2 more posthumous miracles. A woman cured of an eye affliction, and here you can see the woman who was about to be cured by St. Francis here. And if you look carefully, you can see that her eyeballs are sort of hanging out of their sockets. And a woman cured of a fistula. You can see here's the woman, here's the fistula, and there she is after the miracle leaving the church where the friars were ministering and healed, cured. Let us turn to the next extant panel, the little known and little studied image of Orte, created around 1260. In this panel, we see a certain shift, but one that continues to support the development of our main point here, that St. Francis is a creation to promote certain agendas and should not be confused with the Francis of Assisi of history. In the Orte panel, the top two scenes are the familiar scenes of the Stigmata and the Preaching to the Birds. But the two bottom stories offer us new and unique images. Time allows us to consider only one of these. Here we see a depiction of the miraculous sermon in Alessandria. In this story, a heretic tries to trip up Francis to reveal him as a hypocrite. The night before this sermon, Francis was invited to supper at the home of a man of great renown. Here, faithful to the gospel and the rule, Francis eats what is placed before him, a capon, which was considered at the time a luxurious, rich meal. During the meal, a heretic, disguised as a poor beggar, comes to the door seeking alms. Francis gave the impostor a piece of the capon. The next day, while Francis was preaching, the heretic proclaims that Francis was a hypocrite for eating rich food and goes to show the evidence, which miraculously is changed into a fish, as can be seen here in the Orte panel. With that, the heretic begs forgiveness, does penance, renouncing his heresy. With that, the fish turns back into a capon. This is the first story from the life of Francis of Assisi that we have encountered, other than the Stigmata and the Preaching to the Birds. Here we see Francis doing what Francis of the history actually did, preaching penance. But there is a bit of a catch. The Franciscan friars in Orte at this time were not so much involved in preaching penance, but rather in preaching the Inquisition against heretics. They were known to have pursued known heretics to the point of burning their homes. It is hard to imagine the Francis of history being involved in such a violent ministry. But here, the friars of Orte co-opt this charming story from the life of Francis of history to defend their own radically different understanding of the form of life of Francis. Here, the friars of a later age are not creating an image of the Francis of history, but rather they are creating an image of St. Francis in their own image. Hence, the development of our main point, that St. Francis is a creation to promote certain agendas and should not be confused with the Francis of Assisi of history. Let us now turn to what is certainly the masterpiece of the Vita icon genre, the image that is today in the Bardi family chapel at the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. Here we see similar dynamics, the friars crafting a certain image of St. Francis, created in their own image of the life of the Franciscan friars as it was lived in the 1260s, but with a very interesting agenda. Here, we see Francis presenting the primitive rule to Pope Innocent III for confirmation. Notice Pope Innocent receiving the rule text in his left hand and then gesturing with his right hand, pointing out back into the world. As the early sources tell us, Innocent III accepted Francis and his companions and their form of life, which is approved by the church. And then they are sent back out into the world to preach. So the message is clear. The life of the Franciscan friars has the approval of the church, and the church, in turn, has commissioned the friars to preach. Now, while this seems obvious to us today, in the 1260s, the secular clergy were highly suspicious of the Franciscan friars and were trying to have them suppressed. And they were almost successful. But here the message is clear. The Franciscan friars have the approval of the church, and they are commissioned to preach. Perhaps the most famous example of Francis preaching penance, that is, preaching conversion, is in his encounter with Sultan al-Kamil in Damietta, Egypt, during the Fifth Crusade. But here we see something slightly, although significantly, different. Notice that Francis is holding an open book, perhaps the scriptures, or a written out sermon. Both seem most unlikely. Francis was relatively illiterate, and he knew the scriptures from memory. Also, and this is very difficult to see in the image, but notice his right hand. Again, it's difficult to see, but he is holding his thumb and next two fingers up, with the two other fingers folded down. What does this mean? Most likely, this is an indication of Francis preaching about the triune, three-person God and the two natures of Christ. Hence, Francis is not preaching penance, he is preaching doctrine to the Sultan, who would not have believed in either of those two Christian doctrines as a faithful Muslim. Again, the friars are co-opting the story from the life of Francis of Assisi to create a Saint Francis who defends their own form of life from a much later, much different time. The learned, ordained friars preaching doctrine to mass audiences in the massive church of Santa Croce. On the other hand, there are some rather subversive, if you will, images in this panel, which do show some lingering connection to the Francis of history. Here we see the famous story of Francis accusing himself of hypocrisy, doing public penance at the Cathedral San Rufino in Assisi. Notice he has stripped himself down to his underwear with a rope around his neck, tied to the pillar where criminals were whipped in punishment. If nothing else, we can definitely say that the Francis of history was a man totally absorbed by the notion of doing penance, in living a life of constantly seeking conversion, metanoia, as we saw when we considered the opening words of his testament. The life of living and preaching penance inspired others to follow him. Here we see a group of men dressed like Francis in the previous image, with that same rope around their necks, approaching the altar at Santa Croce, seeking to do penance. We will consider this theme in detail next month, but for now it is enough to observe that the word and example of Francis of Assisi did indeed inspire countless others to live a penitential life. It is most appropriate that this scene be depicted in an image from Santa Croce. As you may know, Francis inspired members of the laity to embrace a life of penance. Eventually, these groups of penitents will become canonically associated with the Franciscan friars. Where is one of the places where that happened initially? Florence. Hence, this image speaks to the realities of Franciscan life in this particular locale. This is an image that would have spoken to the people of Florence who came to Santa Croce. Again, these presences of St. Francis as penitent and inspiring others to a life of penitence is somewhat subversive, as we learn about this most clearly from the canceled Testament. We see this even more powerfully in the next scene we will consider. But first, let us remember that after he was imprinted with the stigmata, Francis's desire was to return to where he began, to living with and serving the lepers. So, in the first life of St. Francis, we read about his life after the stigmata. He wanted to return to serving lepers and to be held in contempt, just as he used to be. He intended to flee human company and go off to the most remote places, so that, letting go of every care and putting aside anxiety about others for the time being, only the wall of the flesh would stand between him and God. Hence, while depicting Francis living with and serving the lepers in his earliest days was very problematic, there was another opportunity to present this central value, an aspect of the form of life of the Francis of history. Here we see Francis ministering to lepers after the stigmata. Notice there are two images of Francis, each one marked by the stigmata. The Francis on the left is cradling a suffering, disfigured leper in his lap, the way a mother would hold and comfort her child, the way that Mary cradles the body of her dead son in the Pietà of Michelangelo. The Francis on the right is bathing the wounds of one leper while two others are watching, waiting their turn. Notice the look of content on their faces. Despite their suffering, they know joy and peace through the ministry of Francis of Assisi. We can say that this is doubly subversive. First, because the story is really rooted in the canceled Testament, but also because by this time, very few Franciscan friars were engaged in this type of ministry. Most were now educated, ordained, focused on education and clerical, sacramental ministry, and doctrinal preaching. The age of friars ministering to lepers was receding into a past golden age. But this image reminds the friars where they came from and who they were called to be in the primitive life of Francis of Assisi and his companions. The presence of these subversive images in a panel painting in Florence is actually not surprising. Around the time that this image was created, there were movements of reform arising in the Franciscan friars. These reform movements were rooted in the agenda of the Bardi panel. The demographics of the friars had indeed moved away from the original illiterate laymen who were Francis of Assisi and his companions. The order was now primarily comprised of learned, ordained clerics. In fact, there were very strict rules against accepting lay brothers in the years following the death of Francis. But again, in Florence and other places, there was a wave of reform arising, a movement that accepted the change in the demographics, but desired a return to the emphasis on penance and poverty that marked the early primitive movement. Some of the main early figures of this reform movement were associated with the friary at Florence at the time of the creation of the Bardi image. Hence, this panel clearly supports the agenda of this nascent reform movement. Again, the point is not to get lost in the weeds of the early history of the Franciscan friars, but to see our main point, that St. Francis is a creation created through the lenses of the agendas of the creators of these images. In this case, the Franciscan friars in Florence. One sees that these different communities of friars had very different agendas and images of St. Francis. It is no wonder that in the following centuries, they would come to tragic divisions to the point of physical violence and killing one another. But the main point here is clear. St. Francis is a creation of the Creator, in whose image and agenda that it is created. And like a prism, any iconographic image bends and filters the light of Francis of Assisi. It is limited and unable to completely manifest and communicate the mystery that is Francis of Assisi. And the same is true of any image of God or a saint, or any attempt to create an image of you. You are a mystery that cannot be contained in any image or in an infinite number of words in a text. God, Francis of Assisi, and we are all mysteries meant to be embraced, not figured out and controlled by the limits of art or words, or even the limits of our own minds. Hence, to create St. Francis is to kill Francis of Assisi in some lesser or greater ways. In conclusion, then, Walter Benjamin stated that an image, like the Vita icons of St. Francis, have what he called an aura, which he defined simply as an image that you look at and it looks at you. That definition, as simple as it is, has profound implications for spirituality. As Miriam Bratu Hansen has observed, in the return gaze of the image, we see ourselves, our own history, and our world. We see our achievements and limitations and failings. Hence, these images are also mirrors, a notion that Clare of Assisi speaks about in her letters to Agnes of Prague. When we look at them, we see not only the persons depicted in the image, we also see ourselves reflected back to us. Walter Benjamin observed something similar when he noted that in a certain famous character, the audience recognizes its life. The beholder sees themselves reflected in that same famous character. Who was that famous character? Mickey Mouse. Think about those very early Mickey Mouse cartoons, like Steamboat Willie. These cartoons were just coming out around the time that Walter Benjamin was doing his work. And he and the society of its time were truly captivated by these very simple forms of entertainment. But he saw something profound there. These cartoons, in his opinion, were so successful because in Mickey, we see things about ourselves. We learn things about ourselves. And thankfully, we can laugh at ourselves through Mickey's adventures and foibles. So we come to this, given all we have said, all we have seen, will the real St. Francis please stand up? Is it Francis the miracle worker? Is it the complex St. Francis, the educated cleric, yet subversive reformer? Is it the image you created in your own imagination at the very beginning? Or is it this lovely image, which I call Walt Disney's St. Francis Nightmare? Which one of them is the real St. Francis? By now, hopefully you can answer this question. All of them. They all reflect someone's image of Francis of Assisi. And that is the point. We all create St. Francis in our own image, reflecting our own values and agendas. Because of that, each of these presences of St. Francis can be transformative of spirituality. First, as prisms of perfection. Each image allows an interpretation of the light of Francis of Assisi to shine into our world today. Each one rooted in that light in order to be a valid interpretation, but amplifying some aspects and muting many others. Just as a prism bends and filters light, creating and projecting beautiful spectrums of that original light, the light that was the Francis of Assisi of history, the light that is communicated to us today in these images of Saint Francis that others and ourselves have created. Secondly, each of these images serves as mirrors. Like an old Mickey Mouse cartoon, we see ourselves and our experiences of life reflected in that image. We measure ourselves against the image. And in that experience, we are perhaps changed, transformed. We experience metanoia. We do penance. Amen. We'd like to thank you for joining us for this video talk about an aspect of the life of Saint Francis of Assisi, but also in that enterprise of creating images of Saint Francis. We'll continue next month with our third talk in the series, which is entitled The Joy of Doing Penance. We will focus in that talk about Francis as a penitent and what exactly does it mean to say doing penance. So that will be our topic for next time. So please watch out for our social media platforms and through the emails from the Companions of St. Anthony to see when and how you can sign up and register for that talk, which will be live on November the 16th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 7:30 Eastern Time. And then, of course, like this video, after the live presentation, some period after that, the video talk will be made available on YouTube for you to enjoy for some period of time after that, for those who were not able to join us at that specific date and time. So until then, God's blessings upon you all. And we look forward to seeing you for our next talk, the third in the series, The Joy of Doing Penance. Until then, peace and good from all of us here at the Shrine of St. Anthony, and special blessings to all of our companions, the companions of St. Anthony.